This is the fourth and final video in a four-part series on building a top headlines app using SwiftUI. In this video, I'm first going to fix an omission I made in my APIService.APIError enum, and then I'm going to do what I had suggested you might try, and that is to add the ability for a user to select a country from which to fetch the news. There's nothing iOS 15 related about this feature, so we can develop it and make it available for both iOS 14 and 15 installations. I'll also add an iOS 15 only feature that will give the ability to pull to refresh and fetch the next batch of news articles for the country of choice. And then finally, after testing our app in iOS 14 and 15, we can merge our development branch back into our main branch. Before I get started, let me request that if you enjoy the video, please leave a comment below and give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. Make sure you ring the bell to get notified of new videos. And if you want to support my work, you can buy me a coffee. If this is something you want to learn, then keep watching. If you have followed along with this project from the beginning, you can continue using the same project. Or you can download the starter project from the link in the notes below. That is the completed project from video 3. Just make sure that you follow the initial steps in video 1 to secure your own newsapi.org API key. First up is the APIError enum in our API service class. I go through all this problem to create the NSLocalized string for the enum case, and I never use it. I need to add a localized error for the enum, so first add localized error conformance to the enum itself. Next, we'll add a computed property called error description, which is, as you can see, an optional string. And then we'll switch on self. Now, since there is only one case, we can just say case.error, and then because it has an associated value, we'll say lit description, where the description will represent the associated value, and then we'll return it. Now then, in our getNews functions, when we print the error.localized description, because they are all APIService.API errors that we have bubbling up here, we'll get that nice description printed. I can also remove this thread print now, as we have fixed that issue. Next up then is the ability to choose from where you want to get your news. We already have our default, which is set in our constants file, but let's give the user the ability to pick a country. And you may recall when we looked at the documentation for top headlines, there was a list of countries that were supported. These are the two-letter codes for the countries that we can pass in as the country argument in our URL. What I want to do is to create a struct that will have the name, code, and as an added bonus, the emoji flag for each of these countries, and then display the current choice above the list of articles with a button allowing the user to make a choice from a different country. When selected, then the list will refresh and a new set of news articles will be displayed. Creating that struct and the static array of these objects is not difficult. It's just time-consuming. So I've created a gist with that struct, the static array, and a simple function that I'll go over in just a minute. So go to the link provided in the description below and locate the gist, and then copy the raw code to your clipboard. Next, return to Xcode and create a new file called country. Paste your clipboard contents into that file, replacing the contents that are already there. As you can see, there is a country struct that conforms to the identifiable protocol. So there is an ID property along with name, country, and flag string properties that I wanted. I have a static array of countries that is simply an array containing the country objects for all of the countries in the provided list. In addition, there is a static function for country that will accept a two-letter code and compare the lowercase version to the lowercase version of all the codes in our countries array, and then return the matched one. Now I have force unwrapped here, which normally is not a good thing, but I'm going to be presenting a list to pick from that consists of this array of countries only, so there is no way that the user could select an invalid code. Now we have to add this functionality to the News view model. First, we'll create a published property called country to represent that country, and as a default, pass in your constants.country to the country function, which is that two-letter code, so that when the view model is created, it will display the news from your default country. Next, create a computed property that will create a new country endpoint using this new value. So let's just copy the endpoint computed property from our constants file and manipulate it. We'll replace self with constant, which is our enum, in the first and third instances, and then remove it completely from the second one, but add in .code so that we can access the two-letter code. Next, we'll change the URL in both of our cases to country endpoint. Let's test this now. And I see I get the same list of articles from our default country. Now we're going to be presenting a modal sheet containing a list of countries from which to choose. So we're going to need a Boolean property that we can toggle to present that view. So in Content View, create a new state property called Change Country and initialize it as false. Next, as we want this to be available for both iOS 14 and 15, we can create our current selection and button at the top before we present our list. So within the Z stack, embed both of our news list views within a V stack, a vertical stack. Then, as the first item in the V stack, we'll create a check first to see if the view is not being loaded. Next, we'll create an H stack, and it's going to be composed of the following. First, a text view that will present using the string interpolation, the view model's country.flag, a space, and then the view model country's name. I'll set the font size to title, and then add a spacer to push it to the left side. Then on the right, I'm going to create a button where the action simply sets change country to true and a label that says change. And I'll add some horizontal padding. Now we need to create our country list view. So create a new SwiftUI file and call it country list view. Now this is going to be available for both iOS 14 and 15 targets. So we can use any of the iOS 15 features. So we'll need to present a list of countries when a row is tapped, dismiss the row, and reload our articles for the specified country. This is a very simple view to create, so to save some time, I'm going to remove the preview so I can see all the code on a single screen. Now this means that we'll need an environment variable called presentation mode. Now if we were going to be iOS 15 view only, I could use another new environment variable called dismiss that is much simpler to use when dismissing the modal. But since we want this to work for both iOS 14 and 15, we still have to use presentation mode. We also have to pass in a binding to the current selected country so that when we tap, we can update this value and dismiss the screen. For the list then, we iterate through the country.countries And then for each country, I'll create an H stack. The first item will display a text view for the country flag and then the country name. I'm going to apply a spacer to push it to the left. And because we want the whole row to be tappable, I'll set a content shape modifier of rectangle. And then finally, I will assign an on-tap gesture. In the body, we can set our selected country, self.country, to country, and then issue the dismiss command on the presentation mode's wrap value. We have everything we need now to return to Content View and present our sheet when the Change Country button is tapped. We can attach the sheet to the VStack, but I want to use the isPresented form, which has also an onDismiss action. For the onDismiss action, I want to set the articles array back to an empty array and then call the getNews function. Now the content will just be our new country list view, passing in our current country as a binding. So let's test. Let's pick a country. How about United Kingdom? Great, it appears to be working. How about China? I get this error, and notice this localized string description. It is an API error, and this is because the API is not perfect. It appears that the feed for some countries has JSON that can't be decoded because of control characters, and I even found an instance where occasionally the image URL was not even a URL. This happens a lot with countries with a different character set. And also, this loading screen never stops. So rather than spending a lot of time trying to fix this by looking at coding keys, etc., I've decided that I will simply gracefully dismiss this fetching the news screen and let the user pick another country. This is not the best UI, and you might consider showing some kind of alert, but that is beyond the scope of this tutorial for now. So to dismiss this screen then, all we have to do is return to the getUser function. And in both instances where we print the error, we'll need to set isLoading to false. And in the iOS 14 version, because we're in a closure, we'll need to use self. Let's try it again one more time. And you can see this time that it quickly dismisses when there is an error. You'll find this inconsistent with the feed, so sometimes some countries will work and other times they will not. I have found, however, that the Canadian, US, UK to be consistently stable though, but let's try Australia. It works fine. So before we go on, let's commit our changes to our Git repository before we're moving on to the addition of the last feature. If we return to the documentation for the top headlines endpoint one more time, we can see that there are two properties that we can issue as request parameters. One is the page size, which is the maximum number of results per page requested, where 20 is the default that we are using, and I'm fine with that. But if there are more than 20, I'd like to look at these as well, and that's where the next parameter, the page, comes in. One of the properties in the response object that we currently ignore is total results. So if we know how many articles we can fetch each time and what the total number of articles there are, and then we can just add in and change the page parameter to fetch next or the first pages on request. Adding an @page=1 parameter to our URL request now will give us exactly the same results that we currently have. We'll just need to increment that number and then go back to 1 again when we've reached the end. So we'll need to get that total results back into our model. So return to the news model and then add in one more property below articles, let total results as an int. In the news view model then, we'll create two new published properties, both ints, the first one being for that total results, and we'll initialize it as 0. And then for the second one, let's track the current page, so we'll call it that, and initialize it at 1, which is our initial pull. Next, I want to create a computed property that will calculate the number of pages we get based on the fact that we know the total results of our fetch number, and that's 20 by default. So let's call that variable numPages, and it will be an int. Now, since total results is an integer, when we divide by 20, it will produce another int, but without the decimal portion. I can convert this result to a double and compare it to when I double total results, making it a double, and then divide by 20.0, and then that will give me a double as well. So if those two results are the same, we can simply return total results divided by 20 as being the number of pages. But since total results divided by 20 will always round down if there is a remainder, we'll add 1 to it and return. Next, I can create a function that we can call each time we complete our getNews function that will increment the current page when it reaches the numPages and set it back to 1. So, create that function called incrementPage, and then setting the current page will depend on whether or not the current page is equal to the numPages. If it is, we'll return 1. Else, we'll increment and return current page plus 1. We're going to have to modify the country endpoint now to use this new page parameter. So let's add page equals plus the current page. However, we can't add strings and an int together, so we'll have to turn current page into a string itself. Now, this is going to be an iOS 15 feature only because we're going to use the pull refresh that is only available for iOS 15 for SwiftUI. So in this first case, when we fetch our JSON, we'll set the total results equal to the news.totalResults. Now, believe it or not, we only need to do one more thing to make this all work. In Content View, we can attach a new modifier to the News List view, and that is one called Refreshable. This creates a pull to refresh, and in the closure, we can tell it to call the view model's increment page function, and then get the news. Let's try this out on iOS 15 on my iPhone 12 Pro simulator. I'm seeing the first 20 posts from Canada. Now I know that there are 38 in total, so I'm going to pull to refresh, and quickly I see the loading state dialog, and the next 18 are then loaded. If I pull once more, I've reached the limit and I'm back to the first set. This is pretty good, isn't it? Now, we've been testing on an iOS 15 simulator, but we should be testing on an iOS 14 device or simulator as well. You might not have any iOS 14 devices around, but I can add those simulators to Xcode. From the window menu, choose Devices and Simulators. Tap the plus button to add a new simulator, and if the iOS version doesn't reveal an iOS 14 option, you can download them. I'm going to download the iOS 14.4 simulators. So tap on the download button and go for a coffee. Don't ask me why I didn't download the 14.5 simulators. I made a mistake, okay? Now this can take quite a while to download, so be patient. As I said, go have a coffee. Now when you return, you'll have your iOS 14 simulators. So exit Xcode and reopen it again. You can now see we have the iOS 14 options for simulators available to us. So let's choose again an iPhone 12 Pro, but for iOS 14.4. It looks the same when I run it, but when I pull down, nothing happens because we made that feature only available if you're running iOS 15. But what about selecting a country? Well, we can see that I can change the country, and when I tap it, I can select another country. Well, now that we've tested and see that it's all working in both iOS 14 as well as iOS 15, it's time to commit your project again to Git and submit it to the App Store if you want. Bearing in mind that without having a paid-for key, your total number of users will be restricted to 100 requests a day. What I do after a successful submission then to the App Store is to merge my development branch back to the main branch. So I'm going to open the source code navigator and check out the main branch. I can then right-click on the development branch and choose Merge Development into Main. That's it. Our main branch and development are now identical. Now I only work on the development branch, so I'm going to check it out one more time and make any changes there so that my main branch is always the one on the App Store. I hope you've enjoyed this series and have learned at least one new thing. If you want to support my work, you can buy me a coffee. No obligation, however. Thanks for watching.